In July 2022, 4 European bison stepped out of transport crates into a 560-hectare woodland in Kent, England. The first wild bison on British soil in 6,000 years. No fanfare, no ceremony, just 4 enormous animals dropped into a dying forest, and a team of conservationists standing back to see what happened next. What happened next broke the model. For decades, the most respected woodland ecologists in Britain had worked this exact forest with the best tools modern conservation could offer: chainsaws, heavy machinery, coordinated volunteer programs, and significant public funding. The woodland looked healthy from above. A thick, unbroken green canopy stretching across the Kent countryside, impressive from any aerial photograph. What that canopy concealed was a forest suffocating from the inside. A sealed light environment so starved of disturbance that rare plants had no pathway to establish, soil organisms were functionally absent, and the understory had collapsed into biological silence. Years of tidy, professional, well-intentioned human management had made things worse. Within weeks of their release, these 4 animals had done something the machinery could not. This is the story of a species hunted to total wild extinction by 1927, reduced to a genetic bottleneck of just 12 surviving zoo individuals, and then painstakingly rebuilt over a century through one of the most ambitious captive breeding programs ever attempted. Also that 4 females could be dropped into a forgotten English woodland and asked to do what no conservationist's budget had been able to accomplish. To understand why it worked, you first have to understand the lie that the canopy has been telling for a very long time. But that impression is a lie told by the canopy. Stand at the edge of West Blean and Thorndon Woods in Kent, and the view is convincing. Hundreds of hectares of ancient woodland, thick with sycamore and birch, the canopy locked together overhead in an unbroken ceiling of green. To any casual observer, and to most aerial surveys, this forest reads as healthy, mature, thriving. The understory tells a different story. Drop below that canopy and the light disappears almost entirely. Not filtered, gone. The sealed crown overhead intercepts over 90% of available sunlight before it can reach the forest floor, leaving the ground beneath in a state of permanent ecological shadow. In this shadow, the rare wildflowers that once defined ancient British woodland cannot germinate. The bare, disturbed soil that specialist insects and reptiles require does not exist. The structural diversity, the deadwood, the open glades, the exposed mineral earth, that makes a woodland a functioning ecosystem rather than a biological warehouse has been slowly erased. What remains is impressive architecture housing very little life. For decades, the Kent Wildlife Trust and its conservation partners understood this problem and attacked it directly. Chainsaw crews were deployed on rotation. Heavy machinery was brought in to fell problem trees and break the canopy seal in targeted areas. Volunteer working parties cleared bramble and scrub by hand across thousands of hours of organized effort. The interventions were well-funded, scientifically informed, and relentlessly consistent. The woodland kept dying. The machinery worked only where the machinery reached, and a 560-hectare woodland does not stay open. Nature closed behind every cut. The economics alone made total management impossible. What this forest needed was not a better chainsaw. It needed something that would work every day of the year, across every hectare, without a budget, without a schedule, and without being asked. The question was what? The framing of this decision matters. The Kent Wildlife Trust did not choose European bison because they were available. They chose them because they were the last surviving example of a megaherbivore that had co-evolved with British woodland for hundreds of thousands of years before humans removed them from the equation entirely. These animals did not need to be trained. They did not need to be introduced to the concept of a woodland. The woodland was already encoded in them at a level deeper than instinct. What makes this extraordinary is that they should not exist at all. The European bison, Bison bonasus, was hunted continuously across its range for centuries, for meat, for sport, for the simple reason that a forest containing an animal that large was considered unfinished wilderness, something to be corrected. By the early 20th century, the populations in the wild were not declining. they were collapsing. The last free-roaming herd in the Białowieża forest on the Polish-Belarusian border was wiped out during World War I, when soldiers from multiple armies hunted them for food. By 1919, the forest that had sheltered bison since before recorded history held none. In 1927, a poacher in the Caucasus Mountains of Russia shot the final wild individual on Earth. The species was gone. What remained were 54 animals in European zoos. Scientists and conservationists, recognizing what had been lost, began a meticulous breeding program documented in the European Bison Pedigree Book, a registry maintained to this day. What that pedigree book reveals is almost incomprehensible. Of those 54 zoo animals, only 12 were genetically viable enough to found a new population. Every single one of the approximately 7,000 European bison alive today, including the 4 females standing in a Kent woodland in 2022, descends from those 12 individuals. 12 animals rebuilt a species. That fact changes what happened in Kent from a conservation project into something else entirely. These were not rescue animals being given a second chance. They were the product of a century of deliberate, painstaking resurrection, deployed with precision into a landscape that had been waiting for them since the Stone Age. The question was no longer whether they belonged there. The question was what, exactly, they were about to do. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be scheduled. Before the bison arrived at Wilder Blean, the standard conservation framing for a project like this would have positioned the animals as beneficiaries, a threatened species given sanctuary, a population protected and preserved. That framing is wrong, and the Kent Wildlife Trust knew it was wrong from the beginning. These animals were not brought to the woodland to be saved. They were brought to the woodland to work. What they do is precise, and it operates on 4 simultaneous fronts. The first behavior is bark stripping. A European bison will drive its lower incisors beneath the bark of a mature tree and tear upward in long vertical gouges, exposing the pale cambium layer beneath. This is not random damage. Dead standing wood killed deliberately by the animal becomes habitat for the specialist beetles, fungi, and cavity-nesting birds that a sealed living canopy cannot support. A chainsaw can fell a tree. It cannot decide which tree, in which location, at which stage of decay, every single day of the year. The second behavior is wallowing. The females drop their enormous bodies to bare earth and roll violently, using their shoulders and haunches to churn the soil into shallow, bowl-shaped depressions. These wallows expose mineral earth. They collect rainwater. They become the precise microhabitats that reptiles, rare invertebrates, and specialist plants require to establish. The Kent Wildlife Trust had spent years attempting to create analogous disturbance artificially. 4 animals created dozens of wallows within weeks. The third and fourth behaviors, tree knockdown and selective grazing, operate at the landscape scale, physically redirecting light to the forest floor in patterns no human work party could map or replicate. Together, these 4 behaviors constitute an ecological engineering program running continuously, at no cost, across every hectare the animals occupy. Field report. We are tracking how different landscapes recover across the globe. Drop your city and country in the comments below. What wild animal is native to your region that people rarely see anymore? The forest was receiving everything it needed. The only remaining question was whether, after 6,000 years of silence, it still remembered how to respond. But the project is not without controversy. A European bison weighs between 500 and 900 kilograms. When one of them decides to push a mature birch tree over, the tree comes down. When 4 of them move through dense scrub at pace, the scrub does not survive the encounter. What Wilder Blean looks like now, from the inside, is not what the British public expects a protected ancient woodland to look like. It looks wrecked, bark torn in long strips from standing trunks. Trees tilted at angles that suggest structural failure. Muddy, bowl-shaped craters scattered across what used to be a neat forest floor. Corridors of flattened vegetation wide enough to drive a vehicle through. To a conservationist's eye, this is evidence of the system working. To a dog walker, expecting a Sunday morning stroll through a managed nature reserve. It is alarming. Britain has a particular relationship with its countryside. It is a relationship built on the assumption that nature, left unsupervised, becomes a problem to be solved. Footpaths are supposed to be clear. Woodland is supposed to be walkable. The countryside is supposed to look like it is being looked after, which, in practice, has always meant it should look like it is being controlled. The bison do not make that possible. The project team faced immediate regulatory friction. Public right-of-way legislation required that footpaths through the reserve remain accessible. An animal that weighs nearly a ton and has no particular interest in human timetables does not naturally accommodate public rights of way. The solution was infrastructure, elevated walkways, and dedicated crossing structures, informally referred to by rangers as bison bridges, built specifically to route human foot traffic above and around the animal's range. The project had introduced apex-scale ecological disruption into a landscape governed by Victorian countryside law. And now came the real test, not whether the bison could do the work, whether the work had actually mattered. The results at West Blean arrived faster than anyone predicted. Conservation ecology is a discipline accustomed to patience. Meaningful ecosystem recovery is typically measured across decades, not months. Baseline surveys are conducted, targets are set at 5- and 10-year intervals, and researchers learn to manage expectations against the slow, incremental pace of biological change. The Kent Wildlife Trust entered the West Blean project with that framework intact. They expected to wait. They did not have to wait long. Within the first year, the wallow sites created by the bison began supporting species that had no recorded presence in the woodland under managed conditions. Dung beetle larvae appeared in the animals' droppings so rapidly that rangers openly questioned the mechanism. There was no obvious source population, no recent sighting history, no pathway that conventional ecology could cleanly account for. Fungi began colonizing the disturbed bark and exposed deadwood within weeks. Then the broader survey data began to accumulate, and the numbers made the hypothesis impossible to dismiss. In 2021, before the bison arrived, ecologists recorded 36 slow worms across the entire reserve. By 2023, the count had risen to 58. Grass snake sightings, a species requiring the exact combination of bare earth, sun exposure, and prey density that the bison were generating, had quadrupled. Rare invertebrate species were establishing in the wallow depressions. The woodland floor, sealed and biologically silent for decades under the unbroken canopy, was generating life at a rate that contradicted every projection. The forest had not forgotten, it had been waiting. 4 animals, descended from 12 survivors, had accomplished in 18 months what coordinated human management with modern equipment had failed to achieve across a generation. The destruction was the healing. The chaos was the design. Field report. If you had the power to reintroduce one locally extinct animal back to your exact geographical location, what would it be? Let me know your city and your animal in the comments. And West Blean is not the end of this story. It is the proof of concept. What is happening at West Blean is not a return to the past. The founding 4 have become a herd. Calves have been born inside the woodland, animals that know no other landscape, that have never seen a transport crate, that have lived their entire lives inside the specific ecological reality they are simultaneously creating. The bison bridges still stand. The regulatory frameworks are still in place. But underneath all of that human infrastructure, the forest floor is doing something it has not done in centuries. It is diversifying. It is opening. It is filling with life that had no pathway to arrive until 4 enormous animals showed it the way in. Consider what has actually been demonstrated here. A sealed canopy is not a healthy forest. Human management, however well-funded and well-intentioned, cannot replicate what a large animal does simply by living. A species can be reduced to 12 individuals and still carry, encoded in its biology, the precise behaviors a landscape needs. Ecological destruction and ecological healing are in certain conditions the same event. The forest remembered. The animals knew. The humans finally stepped back. If those four statements are true, and the data from Wilder Blean makes them very difficult to argue against, then the foundational assumption of modern conservation management, that human intervention is the primary tool of ecological recovery, is not just incomplete. It is, in many of the places it has been applied most confidently, the obstacle. We spent decades believing ancient woodlands needed more management. We were wrong, but Wilder Blean is not the only place where a removed animal is rewriting what we thought we knew about a landscape. In the rivers of southern England, a creature absent for 400 years is engineering an entirely different kind of ecosystem, and the results are just as difficult to explain. Click the video on your screen right now to see what happens when nature reclaims its own plumbing. Subscribe to join the research collective, and we will see you in the next file. The woodland does not need our permission to heal. It never did.